on behalf of India International Center and the Palestine Solidarity Committee, we welcome you for this evening's talk, which is obviously going to be very interesting as we have two experts with us. They'll be speaking in the context of India-Palestine and in the context of decolonization. I have Magid Shihade, who is a professor at the Birzeit University in Palestine, and Sunaina Maira, who is one of the founders of the US academic cultural boycott and is also a professor at US Davis. We know, many of us who've gathered here on this rather cold evening, we know sufficiently about the problem of Palestine and Israel, and we, I presume, are equally concerned about what is happening to the Palestinians. We know they've been facing what was inhuman pounding in November by Israel. There was this, there has been, in fact, recently when I was looking at the news, another attack by Israeli settlers on Palestinian olive fields, on the Palestinians, on the little bit of livelihood that they do have in the West Bank. There is the campaign. We hope that the two speakers are going to shed some light on the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign against Israel. They might hesitate to say it, so I'll just say two words about India and Palestine. And it is very, very unfortunate that the government of India just in November issued a statement after several days about the Israeli attack on Gaza, where we seem to equate the violence. We equate the Israelis and the Palestinians. And we also seem to take a position where we talked about the disproportionate violence used, but we did not say who was responsible for that kind of violence. Later, because there was a little bit of an outcry, we had our minister and both the ministers of external affairs, the Union and the Minister of State, trying to clarify it. But again, the disproportionate word was used without saying that it was Israel that was responsible for the disproportionate violence. So there's been this equation of the two for a long time in Indian foreign policy, and perhaps our speakers would like to speak on it. I would now not stand in your way, and I'll ask Professor Magid Shihade to say a few words.
Good evening, and thank you very much for coming tonight. I didn't really prepare any talk for tonight because for several reasons. One, it's very difficult to speak about Palestine in general, but also specifically when the audience are very mixed. We have some people who have been writing about Palestine for a long time. We have here in the audience some people who started writing recently about Palestine. We have people here who visited Palestine who know from the ground what's happening in Palestine. The difficulty in not preparing a paper is sometimes you miss some details, but I think the details are not important. What's important is generally what are the facts. And there are facts in Palestine similar to many other cases. When I came to India, just before I came, Sunaina was telling me about the events that are taking place in India and the demonstrations after the rape of the women in Delhi. Of course, here we need to agree that there is a fact that took place, a woman that was raped. And similarly, I argue that Palestine as a state, its land and its people politically have been raped, nationally have been raped, economically have been raped. The details, and I think there is a lot of similarities if we focus on even small, closer to us examples, to compare them to larger or distant questions and issues. When the rape took place and the police officer that was killed, the news immediately turned against those who were demonstrating. Why? They were violent, they killed him. They accused the people who demonstrated of killing the person who supposedly was coming to keep order. And in the case of Palestine, we have something similar happened. Not only the question of rape itself became on the side, a kind of sidelined. We keep focusing for the last 60 years on the Palestinian behavior. How did they respond? Did they participate in violence in response to Israeli raping of their own country, their own people, their own dignity? Or would they be better served, their cause would be better served if they behaved differently? And I think even for those who don't understand the facts on Palestine, the details of the question of Palestine, I think we start with something important for us to how to frame the question of Palestine. It is wrong, I think, in my view, to think of the creation of the Israeli state, which is the beginning of the rape of Palestine, within the framework of the Holocaust and response to the Holocaust, because the question of Palestine and the colonization of Palestine started much longer before that. I think the question should be framed similar to the question of rape here. There's a structure that allowed the rape to take place, and that's how we all should be agreeing on it. And the question will be on how we respond to that, how we deal with it. Not whether the rapist was going through some difficult times, whether his parents raised him well or not. It doesn't matter to the Palestinians what happened to the Jews in Europe if they have to pay the price of what Europeans did to the Jews. I think it's important to state the fact that Palestine was colonized by a Zionist movement long before the start of the Holocaust, because there was a structure in Europe that generated colonial movement in different places, colonial experiments in different places. And Palestine is just only one of them. What's specific, and I think Indians should understand the feeling of being colonized more than Europeans, for example, because they went through similar colonial experience. What's specific about the Palestine question is it's a very specific type of colonialism. It's a settler colonialism that does not come to a country to exploit its resources and labor, but actually it comes to displace its own inhabitants. To be a settler colonial, you have to displace the native, take over their land, take over their resources, and wish that they disappear and do everything possible that they disappear. And it happened from before 48. There was decades since the beginning of the British colonial rule in Palestine of displacing Palestinian farmers, taking over their lands, displacing Palestinian businesses, and then with the War of 48, a large scale of displacement took place where about 85% of the Palestinian people became refugees in the neighboring Arab countries at the hand of the Zionist troops who waged the war in 48. It was not the opposite, as we hear often from Israel and its sympathetic voices. What is also specific about the settler colonial case in Palestine, it is built on it's framed through a Zionist ideology that looks at other people in general with contempt, and specifically with the Palestinian natives, that doesn't allow coexistence. It started with segregation, physically, economic segregation, with displacement of the native people. Over 450 villages, which is the vast majority of Palestinian villages, were destroyed. Its people were kicked out of the country to Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, and elsewhere. And then, since then, a constant process of displacement has been taking place. Of course, the Zionist leaders who were writing before and during the colonization, before 48, realized and also expected that the native Palestinians will not accept the fate of being colonized and displaced. And they argued that naturally the Palestinians will resist this colonization, and so the only way for the Zionist settler colonial project to be implemented is by force, and by constantly using force, so that Palestinians don't ever think of resisting or changing the path of the history that the Zionist ideologues planned for Palestine. That's why one of the most basic elements in the Israeli state that is built on the informed by the Zionist ideology is the violent nature of that state. A violent nature that constantly leads it towards towards against the Palestinian people and their Arab neighbors. If we look at the history of the Israeli state from 48 on, we can count countless large wars. For example, 51, 56, we have 67, 73, 82, 87, 90, we have 2000, we have 2006, we have 2008, we have 2011, we have 2012, constantly attacking Palestinians, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank, attacking Lebanon and the neighboring Arab states. That violent nature is not an accident. It is very, at the core, it's very much a result of the violent nature of the Israeli state that was built on what one of its leaders called Jabotinsky, a policy of the iron wall, which is basically constantly building its own weapons and constantly using these weapons to scare the Palestinians and to threaten everyone else who wants to stand in its own way. Related to that nature of the militaristic state of Israel, it's also relationship with other countries. If we look, for example, at Israeli relationship with African or Asian countries, and India is one of these major partners with Israel at the moment, we look at the only or the major product that Israel uses to create these relationships is related to arms and related to security and related to wars. Today, India is among the major importers of Israeli arms. This is after a long history of India being on the side of the Palestinians in the international arena, and also on the ground practically for a very long time, taking in Palestinian students, supporting the Palestinian cause in many ways. Today, that support is waning down, in my view. At the same time, while for a long time there was no relationship with Israel, the relationship with Israel is being upgraded. And this is something that I would like us to discuss for most of the time in our meeting today, rather than giving the lecture and talk. Before I end, I want to give example of how, because oftentimes we are told that the Palestinians are not flexible and Israel is more flexible, that the Palestinians don't want peace and that Israel wants peace. The typical propaganda that constantly used by Israel and its sympathetic voices in the media everywhere, including in India. A month or so ago, the Palestinian leadership decided to ask the United Nations to admit Palestine as basically a member in the United Nations, but not a full member. Based on, the idea was based on UN resolutions and international agreements that will allow a creation of Palestinian state in what's called today the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, which is basically close to 20% of the whole country of Palestine. So what Israel's response to that was actually illuminating about the nature of that state and its also intentions for the future. The Israeli Prime Minister and the Israeli Foreign Ministry spokesperson immediately responded. One, they rejected that step, and two, they said whatever the Palestinians do at the United Nations, things will not change on the ground. And this is something I think needs to be taken seriously. So on one hand, Israel says we want peace, but the Palestinians don't want peace, even though we agree on this two-state principle that allows Palestine to be created in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem with some modifications. We oppose them going to the United Nations to gain membership that basically reflects that plan or in line with that plan. On the ground, Israel immediately decided to build thousands of houses and settlements in the West Bank, basically taking over more lands from the Palestinians, basically stealing land from the Palestinians. Its policy on the ground didn't change also by restricting Palestinian movement. Its policy on the ground didn't change by restricting the development of Palestinian economy, and this is something maybe I already talked to some people here in Delhi about why is it that Palestinian market is not full with Indian products, for example. This is for some people who are related to the business community in India that might ask their own government, why is it that they take from Israel close to $5 billion a year in arms, and Israel doesn't allow Indian products to go into the Palestinian market? Why is it that while India takes $5 billion worth of arms from Israel, Israel doesn't allow India to create relationship with Palestine that doesn't really negate or change the relationship between Israel and Palestine? So in the last few months or in the last year or two, a group of people here from India, concerned academics, writers, activists, artists, decided to launch the Indian campaign for boycott of Israel. And I think this is the first step in my view that should be taken by the Indian people, a movement that should spread out all through the country, that will focus, at least on part, while boycotting Israel, on solidarity with the Palestinian people. Solidarity that allows people to move back and forth, Indians to come to Palestine without lying about their purpose of their visit, so that they could easily get a visa to visit the Palestinians in the West Bank, because when Indians come to the West Bank, they need to get a visa from Israel, because Palestine doesn't give visas, it's not a state yet, so that they could easily stay in Palestine for a period that they wish to, not just a month. They could stay for a semester as a students to take classes at the Palestinian University, or as professors or as artists to stay there for a longer period to interact with the local community, and so also to allow Palestinians to come here on this exchange program. Solidarity with the Palestinian people, I think, should be, while we need to push the Indian government to shift its policy with Israel, we should at least demand from the Indian government at the moment to show support for the Palestinian people on the ground, contrary to the Israeli policy, but also, in my view, as a way to show solidarity in the meantime, while we are trying to get rid of Israeli colonialism. And hopefully that will happen sooner than later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think before asking Sunaina, Maira to speak, we will have some time for interventions and discussion after after her remarks. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Seema, and I really want to thank all the members of the India-Palestine Solidarity Committee that organized this event, and to all of you for coming out to this. I think this is a really important discussion. As an Indian, I'm really happy that this is happening. I'm happy this is happening at IIC, and I'll tell you why later. I'm also really honored because I see so many people here whose work has been so inspirational for me in many ways throughout my life. So it's really humbling in a way to be sitting on this side of the podium. And I'm really looking forward to having a discussion, which I think is also very important and which many of our colleagues and comrades have been initiating. I think it's long overdue. So, as Magid said, this is such a mixed crowd. I know some of you, but I don't know others. And so I'm hoping in the Q&A you can ask questions of things that perhaps you wanted more elaboration on, but perhaps you may also have a lot to share, given that some of you actually are probably more experts on this issue than I am. But I just wanted to sort of say that since the talk was framed around the concept of solidarity, what it means for me as an Indian to think about solidarity with the cause of Palestinian self-determination and liberation. And I think, this kind of broader framework is going to ground the comments I'm going to make later about ways that we can respond to the colonial condition and apartheid condition that Magid has just laid out. So one, I think the principle of solidarity with Palestine is firmly grounded in anti-imperial and also anti-war politics. And I think this is what makes this issue so compelling and also so frustrating in the 21st century, that we're talking about a 21st century colonialism and also, as Magid pointed out, to a hyper-militaristic state with whom our relationship currently is also grounded in militarism. And so therefore it means opposing also militarism where we stand and where we live. The second is the principle of anti-racist and anti-apartheid politics. Now, it's going to be evident to you from my comments that, I've been living and working in the US for a very long time. And so this is shaped by my experiences in the Palestine solidarity and anti-war movement in the US. This may or may not resonate with all of you equally, but I think that the discourse of a racist and apartheid state is one in which people are increasingly beginning to coalesce, even in the US, even though it's extremely difficult to talk about the Palestine question through the lens of race and racism. And this is because of the obfuscation of the nature of Zionist settler colonialism as a racist project. That term has been difficult to use in the US for a long time, but I think it's changing as the analogy to South African apartheid has increasingly taken hold. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But when I came to the US in the late 1980s, I remember very clearly the tail end of the anti-apartheid South Africa movement on college campuses and how widespread it was and how pervasive it was. And so most of us we never drank Coke. I mean, no one ever touched it because it was common sense that because you were in solidarity with South Africa that you would boycott any corporations that were doing business there at the time, and that was just one example. The third principle, actually, I think perhaps this is more apparent in the context of the US solidarity movement, but I'm increasingly begin to wonder if it may or may not be relevant here. You can tell me in the Q&A, which is resisting the censorship of the Palestine question and the lockdown on an open and honest debate around Palestine in the US academy and in the mainstream media. This is one of the reasons why many of us who engaged in Palestine solidarity activism find it's a full-time job, because you may be out of a full-time job if you dare to speak about Palestine. As Edward Said said, it's the last taboo, and it's a struggle over this last taboo that, one can talk about China, one can talk about Burma, one can talk about, of course, Iran and all these other, axes of evil, but one cannot talk about Israel in a critical lens, or you may be out of business. So the Israel lobby, of course, is a very well-established structure of defamation, harassment, intimidation, bullying. They've increasingly turned to lawsuits against US campuses and student movements, and this is what's called lawfare. So these right-wing Zionist groups are increasingly trying to use civil rights law, in fact, which has had a very chilling effect on student activism around the question of Palestine. So you can imagine in a post-9/11 environment, In any case, it's very intimidating for particularly Arab, Palestinian, and Muslim students, but in the general movement also, there has been a really stifling effect, and many students are increasingly very scared because, as in the case of the infamous Irvine 11 students at the University of California in Irvine, they were hauled up by the district attorney in the state. So the state actually went after Palestine solidarity activists for engaging in a peaceful protest as undergraduates on a college campus. There have been tenure battles, there have been numerous attacks on scholars, and in general, these attacks are framed basically around one principle. Given that Israel rarely has political or moral arguments to stand on, and given that it's standing in the global stage, I think that in terms of PR, it's ranked lower than North Korea. It's like 150th or 160th. You know, they do these rankings of states that, you know, have incredibly negative images in the global community. It's doing really badly, given this, you know, ongoing warfare and, you know, violence that keeps happening. So the only argument that the Israel lobby can actually throw out against those who dare to critique the Israeli state is anti-Semitism, right? So any critique of Israel is deemed automatically and inherently anti-Semitic. And given the sensitivity around this in the US, it makes it a very difficult issue. But I think it betrays the lack of an ethical response that, in fact, people who support the state of Israel can offer. In this context, as an Indian anti-war and human rights activist, one of the things that we've also had to challenge within the South Asian community in the US that I'm sure you're aware of is this kind of unholy alliance between Hindutva groups in the US and Zionist groups. So many of you probably are aware that, in fact, the Israel lobby and the Hindutva lobby have worked hand in hand over the last many years. And in California, in fact, in Silicon Valley, they're extremely active, and they have coalitions with names such as Coalition in Defense of Democracy, right? I mean, who's going to stand up against that? But needless to say, I mean, I've had experiences, I can tell you many stories later, of cases in which, in fact, this lobby has gone after South Asian students who dare to actually engage in Arab solidarity activism on college campuses. And I think this is also a very troubling problem that we see in the South Asian and particularly in the Indian community, where in fact there seems to be, again in line with the shift in India and in the Indian state, a similar discourse. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, and the ways in which it propagates very racist notions of Islamic terrorism, for example. So in this context, I became involved with a group of other academics and artists in trying to push back against what we felt was this lockdown on the Palestine question. Really, there are many questions around the world that deserve our attention, including here in India. But for some reason, this question seems to be so difficult to speak about. And this is why. It's not that there are other questions that also don't demand our attention and other forms of violence. And I think this is the point Magid is trying to make. But in 2009, 2010, during the last massacre that happened in Gaza, a group of academics decided that in response to the call from Palestinian civil society for an academic and cultural boycott of Israel, that we would form a national official US campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, US ACB. So a group of us actually came together and we sent out a call for US academics and cultural workers, artists, journalists, filmmakers, and writers, and so on. And we asked them to endorse the call that Palestinians issued saying, we want you to engage in academic and cultural boycott of Israel because nothing else has worked to stop the Israeli states in this ongoing campaign of apartheid policies and violence to make the Palestinian people disappear. Everything else has failed. There has been militant struggle, there has been non-violent struggle, there has been popular resistance, there has been artistic resistance, there's been campaigns in the UN, there have been calls to the global community, and Israel does not stop. So we want you, as you did in the case of South Africa, to engage in boycott, divestment, and sanctions. In a sense, you know, this is a strategy of last resort against a state that will not comply with international law. So nothing else seems to work. So we have to challenge, as members of civil society, in a context in which states don't seem to be enacting their responsibility, or they try and it doesn't work, to comply with this call. I just want to get a sense, how many of you know about BDS, so that I don't go on and on if you already know about it. Can I get a show of hands? I'm a teacher, so I'm going to make you raise your hands. How many of you know about BDS? Okay, a few do, and when you don't know, that's good, because then I can sort of talk a little bit about this, which is that the call that was issued by Palestinians, range of civil society organizations, trade unions, women's groups, students, academics, political groups, and so on, has three main principles. And I think these principles really can frame the concept of solidarity with Palestine, which is, one, they call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS, against Israel until three things happen. And so it's based on a sort of rights-based framework. One is the ending of the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and the dismantling of the Israeli security barrier or the apartheid wall. Two is the right of the Palestinian citizens of Israel to live in full equality, which they don't. Third is the right of return of Palestinian refugees as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. So this is a call framed in international rights. It's nothing more, nothing less. There's no prescription for what the solution should be or how it should be. It's calling on Israel to uphold its obligations to international human rights. For some, that is not even a sufficient framework. They might want to see something even more, but that's what it is. So, one of the reasons why BDS is actually so effective, in my view, and in the view of many other people who have used it as a tool for decolonization, is that it challenges a state whose international legitimacy is one of its few assets and major concerns, that Israel is able to operate with exceptional impunity because, in fact, of a certain legitimacy as the only democracy, quote unquote, in the Middle East or West Asia, and as an outpost of Western civilization, so as this kind of flank against Islamic terrorism and model of a counter-terrorist state. And so, in fact, we know that BDS is effective because, in fact, Israeli think tanks and the state have responded in near panic to the rise of BDS, and they, in fact, have said that US ACB, the academic and cultural boycott, is a strategic threat to the state of Israel. So the Israeli state acknowledges the success and effectiveness of BDS as a tool because they know their legitimacy is extremely important for them in the global stage. And this legitimacy rests on the cultural and academic programs that they have exported around the world. There's an official name for this campaign. The Israeli government launched this campaign in the 2000s. It's called Brand Israel. And they've poured a lot of money into sending around Israeli academics and artists so that, people call it soft power. I think it's actually very important power because it is so necessary. And through this campaign in the US, they've increasingly also reached out to minority groups. So there's an understanding that, in fact, these groups are very likely to begin to identify with an anti-colonial, anti-racist projects, and so therefore they must be targeted. So there's been an attempt to reach out to African-American students, to give them money to come to the DC and work with the Israel lobby, to Latino or Chicano students and academics, and now to Native American artists and writers and academics as well. And so I think you might be beginning to think of parallels that are happening in India, and I'd love to hear about them. But one of the things I just want to point out is that, one, the academic boycott is an institutional boycott. It's not an individual boycott. It's not meant to be a blacklist or a witch hunt against individual Israeli or Jewish academics or writers. It's a boycott of Israeli academic institutions, all of which support the Israeli state, every one of them, including some that are built on stolen Palestinian land or destroyed villages. And the second thing is that cultural boycott does not imply a shutting down of free exchange amongst artists or dialogue, but what it does bring to the fore is that there are projects funded by the Israeli government with the explicit purpose of obfuscating the condition of Palestinians, including Palestinian artists. And so if we are to be in solidarity, there's many ways to collaborate with Israeli artists that do not involve complicity with the Israeli apartheid state. So on that note, when I came to Delhi a couple of weeks ago, I was so excited to open the IIC calendar and see this event listed in it. And then I also noticed that the Israeli embassy was sponsoring not one, but 3 events in 1 month. 3. Now, of course, these events are not about Israeli politics. They're not about, even Israeli contemporary issues. They are about the Star of David and 2 films about the Holocaust. So one has to be very clear that one is not opposing the content of these events. One is not opposed to Israeli Jewish community life, religion, symbols, history, etc. One is opposed to the Israeli government's funding of an event at an institution like the IIC if the IIC is not going to support colonization and apartheid. So that's something to think about. Maybe it's a difficult conversation, but I think it's one that needs to be had in the places which, in which we sit, in which we inhabit. So I think the project of normalization of the Israeli state is actually the question. And I think that this is the complicated issue. How do we oppose the daily normalization and this cultural front? And so there's also, I think, particularly in the US, a lot of focus on interfaith and intercultural dialogue, but oftentimes these programs, as Magid suggested, make a false equivalence between the colonizer and the colonized. And that is something that we really need to think about. But I just want to say that in the context of Nkakpi's work, what's very important, I think, in terms of the academic and cultural boycott is that we cannot separate this cultural normalization from military normalization. I think these are actually on a continuum, and cultural normalization of Israel is needed to make that military and economic and security alliance palatable to particularly the elites, but others in the mainstream as well, right? So that one can either, be in denial or close one ears or even accept it, right? And so I think this, we can have many discussions about, for example, the project of settling Indians in Palestine. But we cannot view Palestine also solely through, I think, the lens of local politics. And this is a point we can talk about later. I think that our own position in solidarity is very important, and the specific location of India or South Asia, but that there are specific issues there. And this was brought up when Magid and I were in Pakistan 2 years ago, and we were involved in the founding with a group of Pakistani left activists of the Pakistanis for Palestine campaign, which was initiated by local activists in Lahore who wanted to actually be in solidarity with Palestine. And they approached Magid and me, and they wanted to actually call for a boycott. Now, in the context of Pakistan, it was less boycott that was relevant, obviously, but more anti-normalization, because there is a great deal of normalization of Israel that's happening in the Pakistani media, including in the liberal English language media, that's very disturbing. There's an identification with the counter-terrorist state, sort of assumption of a common campaign against Islamist militancy, and a kind of very reactionary sort of identification with the US, support for the US war against terror, and a lot of fear and anxiety regarding obviously the strength of right-wing religious politics in Pakistan, but which translates into a real anxiety about Palestine's solidarity as somehow drawing these activists into religious politics. And so many of them have wanted to distance themselves over the years from the Palestine issue rather than reclaiming it through a left secular language and framework. But after 2009, there's been a shift again with the recent massacre. There have been many protests across Pakistan as part of a broader anti-imperialist front and a re-energizing of what's called the new left in Pakistan. And so that's, I think, something to think about, that Palestine is something that can also, has to be centered within this kind of left progressive framework. And so I want to conclude by saying that for me as an Indian, over the years, I've come to realize that solidarity with Palestine is often not just about Palestine. That Palestine comes to stand in for us for so many different things that we care about. And also, it becomes a kind of palimpsest in a way of our own fears, our own anxieties, our own concerns, our own political aspirations. And I want to end by saying that the last year or so, I have actually been doing research on youth activism in Palestine and the youth movement in the West Bank that has emerged since the Arab Spring. And this is a popular movement which is trying to create a new political framework for national politics. And for them, BDS is a very core vision. These young people are really trying to engage around the question of popular organizing and boycott and divestment. And so I was thinking today, what would these Palestinian youth like to see in India? What would they expect of Indian students and comrades and colleagues? And I think they would want us to be in vigorous opposition to complicity with the state of Israel, to write op-eds and articles, to do conferences, to have public debates, to end cultural normalization, such as is happening here at IIC. This is a space we think of our own. It's very important that our politics also begin here, to write letters, to do meetings. And I think that the thing about BDS that's very potent is that it allows people to engage in politics wherever they are. So, for example, I went to a little mall in Gurgaon and I discovered they have a whole store devoted to secret Dead Sea products. And this is an Israeli Dead Sea product company, you know. So a bunch of people, Probeers in Gurgaon, we need to go down to secrets and allow people to see that this is an issue that can be brought into the public sphere. So in any case, I'm going to end there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. I think another, there was a reference to censorship of Palestine, and I think in this whole context of what, especially when countries like India move away from principle to pragmatic foreign policy, the role of the media becomes extremely important. And I think Sunaina and me were discussing it earlier, that there's maybe not even centimeters of space devoted to the Palestinian issue. And if there was more awareness generated by the media, print and electronic, particularly as media is becoming more and more powerful across the world, perhaps many more persons here would have been aware of the of BDS or about the issues facing the Palestinians and the kind of violence they are undergoing on a daily basis. I will open it to the House. I would request everyone to address the speaker to who you would like to answer the question. And also, if you can, identify yourself and keep the comments short. Thank you.
I just want to tell Mr. Magid, if you cannot get visa for Palestine, then how did you come to India? Who signed on your papers? How did you come to India? Why I'm asking this question is, could you get a lot of group of people from Palestine to come to India, you and everybody else? Because I do know the Israel lobby is doing everything to get into every nook and corner in India and win the young people. At the Habitat, they've had about umpteen functions, different functions, maybe very substandard, dancing on the stage and everything, and then they put every young person who's entering the auditorium to lot of search. They put you through the thing, and somebody got very angry. Why do we have to come to our own auditorium? It is not the Israeli embassy. What are you trying to do? Why are you going through this iron railing to get, looked at? So I want you to send more people. And at the IIC, I can tell you one thing. They will not remove, because IIC is not a political institution, so they will not remove Israeli functions, but I suggest that you increase your functions. Because IIC will not take it well, because they get functions from everywhere. Pakistan, enemy. If we have an enemy, we don't have any enemy. But if we do have, they will encourage them to come and perform here or do whatever.
Well, the visa question, one, I have American passport, so I have like 10 years visa, so I don't come here through... yeah, so it's easier for me to come to India or to go anywhere. But let's say if you are an Indian going to visit Palestine, your visa comes through Israel. So you have to go to the Israeli embassy and apply for a visa. And oftentimes, let's say, and we had several cases of friends who wanted to come to Palestine, they had to lie about their visit, not saying that they are coming to support the Palestinians or to work with Palestinians or to visit Palestinians or to stay with Palestinians. They said they are coming to travel, just as tourists, going to holy places and holy cities and so on. So they had to lie to be able to come to Palestine. Israel controls also not only the entry into Palestine, but also the exit. So, for example, Palestinians who have only Palestinian documents, their travel is restricted or controlled by Israel. So they have to get a permit from Israel to travel, and then they go to Jordan, and then from Jordan they travel to other places. But it's not that easy, because you have to have an admission or acceptance from Israel that allows you to travel.
Thanks.
That's one thing that I think maybe the Indian government could do, is that by creating some kind of like structure of permanent exchange between Palestinian students, academics, artists, writers, and so on, is to demand from Israel a kind of guarantee for visas both ways. For Palestinians who cannot easily travel, for me it's easy, but for most Palestinians it's not. And for Indians, that they don't have to lie to come to Palestine. They can say we are coming, part of that exchange program.
There's another question.
You see, it's a common knowledge that US is an unconditional supporter of Israel. And lately there was a positive development in favor of Palestine, when a recognition was given to it against the wishes of US, And the more positive thing is that even the European countries, they went against US. So what do you think? Should we not, should the effort be not made, with these people, with these European countries to prevail upon US, okay, to sort of realize the reality and to be a little more reasonable towards Palestine? What do you have to say on this?
I mean, I think it's important to campaign in different places, and so that more pressure on Israel is put. But I think for me, I'm not interested in Europe or the US. I think Palestinians should be concerned with their own neighborhood, with their own natural environment, which is a third world environment. It should be a work on the people in Asia and Africa and Latin America who had similar experiences. They understand us much more. It's harder, I think, for Europeans and Americans to understand the Palestinians because they didn't go through the same experience. That's one. Two, there's so much baggage around the question of Israel within Europe for their history with the Jews, what happened to them. So a lot of times it's very hard for them to take a clear stand on that question. And that's why I think, and I really don't think there is a huge difference between the interest of certain European countries, the US and Israel, when it comes to the region. And we could see that in many examples. If you look at, for example, how clearly they are, for example, against the nuclear program in Iran. They are all against it. They are all in agreement on that. But they don't have a clear stand on Israeli nuclear program. They don't have a clear stand on Israeli constant violation of UN resolutions, of their own even sponsored peace plans that required from Israel to withdraw from territories occupied in '67. So I'm not really interested in little differences. I think in general they have agreement on controlling, colonizing the region, and Israel is just part of that project. There's little differences between them.
But I'm Gagan Sethi from Gujarat, bring us closer to a reality which, in a sense, we echo in Gujarat. I want to make 2 or 3 issues which I think which will maybe help me understand things better. If I'm looking at expressing solidarity as an Indian, the colonial framework doesn't fit because many of us have passed that colonial framework. I can understand the feeling of exclusion and discrimination from 2 spaces. The 1 or 3 maybe. 1, the Dalit space. And the Dalit space, the feeling of exclusion is much more as a contemptuous. So the people who exclude are contemptuous of the Dalits. When it comes to religious, which is what we are facing in Gujarat, it is hate. And when you put 2 together, it is contemptuous hate. And I'm saying this because if we need to express solidarity, I need to come from a space where I'm feeling the same. And I don't think so. Solidarity is a mind game. It's an emotional space. And therefore, I would really suggest that we would like, and I representing some foundation, to relate with young people from, say, the Dalit Foundation, the Dalit Solidarity, the religious minorities, and still keeping the fact that, yes, we are Indians and that we are multiple identities. So, but just keeping us in the colonial space may not be a very easy or a simple way to move. Just my thoughts on that. Thank you.
I think it's a very important comment, and as I said, there in every local context, there's a specific vocabulary, language, and set of issues, and local activists have to develop that. So I think by all means, and I'm sure, this has happened already, this issue is not new for us in India, that at different moments there's a different language that people use. And actually, I don't think it's a stretch by any means, as you can imagine, knowing racism of the Israeli state towards Palestinian citizens to make that connection of contempt and hate. I mean, it's really kind of a vicious structure and a society where the racism is quite palpable. I guess that I would just say, you know, this is the tension that maybe I was trying to hint at in some ways, that, you know, for example, in the Pakistani case, what I saw was, you know, leftist activists, you know, so mired in their own issues and struggles that in fact they were unable to speak of Palestine because they were so concerned about their own context in which the crushing of the secular left has become such a painful and difficult thing. So I guess there's this tension between trying to have a politics that speaks to the local context and also to be able to speak to that location. That's just my thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Just I want to add just one small thing. I think there is connections with the Dalits, of course, and there is connections with groups that are marginalized and repressed in India, like in other places. So repression, exclusion, racism that takes place against certain groups for being that group is something that is very much similar to the Palestinian question. That doesn't deny also the colonial history and colonial experience, because they all went through the colonial experience and they all know what does it mean to go through it, even though the hope was that after decolonization that things will be better. And that's something actually maybe could also be a part of something to learn, to work with, on not repeating mistakes of others. That's why I think for me it's more important to focus on the South, on Asia, Africa, and Latin America, so that we don't repeat mistakes of states who decolonized officially, but continue to, on the ground, to practice the same policies of exclusion and repression and discrimination against certain groups in that society, of course.
Yeah, good evening. I'm Milun Kothari from the Working Group on Human Rights in India and the UN, and I've was also working with the UN, the Human Rights Councils. I've often been to Palestine. There were 2 points I wanted to make. One is, I think we really need to, as activists in India, understand our own mindset of our policymakers. Why is it that India has gotten closer to Israel while still maintaining its, support of Palestine, both at the UN and, symbolically? And why is it that obviously it has something to do with our also wanting to get closer to the United States and the global security environment. So I think one of the tasks before us is obviously to find out from, I don't know if there are people here from the Foreign Service who can shed some light on that. Why is it exactly that we've had this shift in the foreign policy? The second point I wanted to make is that I agree very much with Magid's point that the solidarity has to come much more south-south. And I think one of the perhaps future tasks would be for civil society leaders in India who have been through many rights struggles and who are going through them as national campaigns to visit Palestine and share that experience. And part of this must also come from our colleagues who are fighting against militarization in Kashmir and in the Northeast. Because essentially the struggle in Palestine is a struggle against militarization, against security policies, against the impunity that you were talking about, Magid. So I'm wondering if we can explore that also as an option. Thanks.
If I can just say one thing, I really appreciate that comment and that suggestion, and that was one of the things that, of course, I had at the back of my mind. In fact, I was just reading the paper yesterday, and there was this article about unmanned aircraft and balloons with cameras being used on India's borders, western and eastern. And of course, as I read down, where did this idea come from? It came from Israel, and there's been some meetings a month ago. I'm sure this is, every other day, but this one was with the Shabak, with Israel's internal security. These technologies are also being used by the US Army in Afghanistan. There's going to be bidding. 49 companies have bid so far, including many from Israel. So it is about this question of militarization, even though the context, I would say, in the 3 locations you mentioned are different, that there are these questions that could link, these different issues.
And of course, like the Israeli brand of being kind of like propagated around the world, that's a state that managed to, it's excellent with the security technology, with arms and so on. So that basically has become a model for many states, not just India. If you look at certain types of changing public sphere of searching, checkpoints, the flying checkpoints, in addition to the arms and so on, the myth is that, and the same thing if you look at the airports, how it shifted in the last 10, 20 years around the world. The myth is that Israel it's good at security, and this is a myth, because in reality it's the least secure country that I have visited and that I have known in so many places. It's so impossible for Israel basically to finish its own project with the Palestinians, even though Israel is much more armed, much more funded, much more supported especially by wealthy Western states. Despite that, the Palestinians could always fight back, and they have been fighting back. A small party, a group in Lebanon called Hezbollah, managed to beat Israel militarily. Israel was defeated in Gaza, constantly being defeated. The issue of being good in security in the airport, it's nonsense, because we go through the airport, and also we know that actually you could go through the airport with many things that are supposedly illegal. We know, for example, that Palestinians could all the time come into Israeli cities and do what they want, if they want to. The decision not to do something with Israel at the moment was a political decision, was not due to Israeli success in security technologies. Actually, it is it's a project. It's an actually economic project that allows Israel basically to sell expertise all around the world, manage airports in Europe, for example. These same airports, for example, allowed bombers to go on through the checkpoints that Israeli experts are running in Holland, for example, that allowed a bomber or someone who was planning to bomb an airplane to go through the checkpoint, go into the airplane, and fly through to the destination. And this is something that happens in many places. It's a myth that more arms actually brings you security, and I think India should learn the opposite lesson of what's doing at the moment. Instead of more arms, I think India could benefit much more from doing much more closer relationship with Pakistan and with China. Because more arms is not going to solve the question. More arms for India, China will create more arms, Pakistan will create more arms. More arms don't get you security. And more checkpoints don't get you security. I mean, it's something that Israel managed to basically benefit from, not necessarily secure other places. And if we look at the question of how secure places are, today they are much more insecure than they were before. So there is no proof, there is no evidence that Israeli security technology managed to deal with the question of insecurity. It's the opposite, actually. It creates its own insecurity.
I want to just comment on that speaker, because he used the word saying that India sought American friendship. It was the other way around. It's America who sought India's friendship because they knew they were ultimately going to leave Pakistan and they needed somebody, an ally in India, and India was a very strong ally. So George Bush tried his best, and since George Bush was getting close to India, Israel was the next one that jumped in, because I remember as a child our passport said all countries except Israel and South Africa. It was written on our passport. For decades we had that on our passport. Suddenly Zubin Mehta was not allowed to come here with his Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra in the early 60s. And he was very upset about that because he was an Indian. He died an Indian. But because he was conducting the Israeli Philharmonic, it wasn't allowed under Nehru's era. Now, suddenly, the whole foreign policy has tilted because George Bush managed to get closer to India, and so Israel was the next one.
Thank you. Thanks. So we will, I have to thank Pramila from India International Center and Geeta Hariharan from the Palestine Solidarity Committee for putting this meeting together. And thank you to our two speakers, Magid and Sunaina, for giving us the time.
Can you mention in Kakli? We should mention in Kakli.
Yeah, well,
yes.
Yeah,
so can I just mention that, there is a vibrant and growing Indian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, and if you haven't already checked out their website, you should do so immediately, and you should endorse it if you haven't done so already. if I may. There's a Facebook
There's a
page too.
Facebook
Yes.
page. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you.